Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ying Zheng, the Director of Asian Initiatives at Western Michigan University's Haneke Institute for Global Education. I also serve as the Director of Timothy Light Center for Chinese Studies. Welcome to Timothy Light Center's webinar series of Spring 2022. Our theme for this semester's webinar is Food in China. And today we're honored to welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Zhangyue Zhou, Zhangyue Zhou from James Cook University, Australia. I would like to invite Dr. Greg Vick, professor from our Department of Geography, Environment, and Tourism, to introduce Dr. Zhou to us. Greg, please.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Professor Zhou, for joining our seminar. Professor Zhou has combined extensive fieldwork, surveys, and the use of archival data in a wonderful career that's extended for a number of decades, focused on food consumption, commodity markets and production, and trade. His commodity trade studies have included studies on rice, other food grains, on meat, and even halal meat consumption, but also other livestock, including beef, pork, and chicken. So his trade studies really intersect with this work, based oftentimes on field work. And I might point out that that Professor Zhou comes from a nominjia, and I always think that's a wonderful thing to have people come from rural areas to work in academia, because we don't have enough of them in the United States. And it provides a very unique perspective that is played out in the articles that I have read in preparation for this. Working in, as well as in terms of consumption and production in China, India, and a number of other countries, he also is focused on trade. And that trade research is really quite impressive. It intersects cross-cultural consumption patterns and changes in consumption with global concerns about food supply and food security. I really enjoyed the halal article, and he's done just a great deal of research. I was very impressed with 3 books in the last 5 years, and just dozens of articles as well. So I would certainly like to welcome Professor Zhou, and I'm looking forward to your comments. Thank you for a wonderful career and for speaking with us today.
Professor Vick, thank you very much for your nice introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. My presentation today is about whether China can sustain its current level of food security. Over the history of China, famine is not new to many Chinese people. Nonetheless, in the past 40 years, China's food security has steadily improved. The improvement was achieved through increased domestic production and increased food imports. From this diagram, we can see that in the past 40 years, the major items of China's cereals have increased quite impressively. But on the other hand, in the meantime, the imports of food have also increased. And in this diagram, we see that the soybean import in year 2020 was a little over 100 million tons. And in this diagram, the other food imports were a bit dwarfed here. But if we do not include soybean, then we see that the imports of other major food items has also increased quite a lot. In recent years, the imports of cooking oil and sugar are on the increase. And altogether, China now imports over 150 million tons of food. 150 million tons, so that's a lot. So with the increased food production and increased imports, China's food security at the moment is comfortable. But then why do we bother talking about whether China can sustain its current level of food security or not? Well, we would like to see that many Chinese people have adequate food consumption, because that will be good news for the Chinese people, but also the good news for the rest of the world, given the size of the population in the country. If China doesn't have a problem with its food consumption, that would be very useful for improving people's food security in many other parts of the world. So it is important for China to have a good position of food security. And that's why I would like to share some thoughts about the likely happenings regarding China's food security in the future. So in my presentation, first, I will spend a few minutes to go through with you a few concepts. And then I will spend a fair bit of time to talk about what happened in China's food security in the past, because that will help us to know how China's food security may head. And then I will highlight some emerging issues and challenges in China's food security management, followed by some recent developments that might have important impact on China's food security. I hope that after I go through the first 4 parts, we would have some ideas about whether China can sustain its current level of food security. For some of you, or probably you people know that the concepts of food and food security, but I thought that it might be useful just in case we might not be too familiar with these concepts. So what is food? Basically, food is any stuff we can eat that can provide calorie, protein, fat, and other essential micronutrients to our body. Then what is food security? Well, according to FAO, food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. So if we look into the food security definition here, there are 5 important dimensions. First one is about food availability. So we need to have sufficient food for all people. The next one is supply sustainability. So not only we have food today, but also we have food for the future. Then having food to eat is important, but the safety and quality of food is also important. Well, we know that not all foods are acceptable to all people of different cultural backgrounds. So cultural acceptability is another dimension. Finally, access to food. We need to make sure that people have the physical and economic access to food. Here, I would like to emphasize that food availability is not equal to food security. Probably for many of us, we could confuse ourselves with food availability and food security. Quite often they think that if food is plenty, then we have a good food security. But according to the definition above, obviously that's not the case. Of course, that food availability is the most important dimension of food security, but it's not all. If we focus too much on food availability, we might neglect some other important aspects of food security. For example, well, I just provide a lot of food to the market, but the food may be not safe. The food may be not of good quality and may have the nutrition compromised. And also, as I mentioned earlier, that different individuals might have different access to food. So if we just look at that food is plenty, but if some people don't have the access to food, then to them it's useless. And obviously, sustainable supply is another important part. So if we focus on food availability today, then that's not good enough. So food availability is not equal to food security. And similarly, we shouldn't mix food self-sufficiency and food security. A higher level of food security is not necessarily associated with a high level of food self-sufficiency. That is, a country may have a very high food self-sufficiency ratio, but that country's food security level is not high. For example, in India, in some years, its level of food self-sufficiency ratio, its food self-sufficiency ratio was over 100%, but that doesn't mean India has a high level of food security. And similarly, in countries like Singapore and Japan, their self-sufficiency rate is low, but their food security level is high. Here, the tricky thing is that if we make use of the international market adequately, that can always compensate the shortage of domestic supply. So it is important that we don't equate food self-sufficiency to food security. Well, then how do we measure the level of food security? There are a number of major frameworks. In my presentation, I will chiefly make reference to the FAO approach and the economist approach. Now, let's move to the second part. What happened in the past regarding China's food security? The Communist Party of China got into power in 1949. Then, since the early 1950s to date, there can be two distinct periods regarding China's food security. One is prior to the 1980s. Food availability was poor and citizens were undernourished far and wide. Since the 1980s, food has been ample and extreme cases of starvation are generally rare. Now, first, before the 1980s, as we can see from this table, before 1980, Chinese people's food intake was very minimal. In the first column here, in terms of grains, it's in kilogram, and these grains are traded grains. And then if we consider that converting paddy to rice at a 70% ratio, wheat to wheat flour at a ratio of 80 or 85%, then there will be at least a sort of a 15% less of this quantity to be available for consumption. So that means for Chinese people in majority of those years, they had about half a kilo a day or less for their food intake. But then we might argue that why don't they take more other foods? But the availability of other foods were also minimal. And the worst thing, as we can see here, is that from the early 1950s to the late 1970s, the food consumption increase was almost nothing, or in some cases got even reduced. For example, vegetable oil, 2.21 kilo to 1979, 2 kilo. And beef and mutton, again, as a decrease. Now, in terms of food grains, which is the major food items for Chinese people, the improvement was very minimal. And by 1978, the per capita consumption was even still below 1952. That's after almost, 30 years. Well, you might imagine that with so low food intake, what happens to the Chinese people? If we convert the food intake to energy intake, we see that Chinese people's food energy, dietary energy intake was low. The data available from FAO is from 1961. So from here, we can see that from a very low start. And up to the early 1980s, it reached the average dietary intake requirement. Can we get rid of this? Does this affect you?
What?
Does this affect you? See what my PowerPoint slides?
Sure.
Yes or no?
Yes.
How do we get rid of it?
We only have a small box on the side, but it's not cutting into your slides right now. We can see the full slides.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll put it here. Anyway, yeah. And even worse, that for quite a few years, it's even below minimum dietary energy requirement. So clearly, we can see that people were suffering from starvation. And then that's the, this graph starts from 1961. But before 1961, 1960, 1959, and this number could be even lower. So with such a low intake, that was probably not even enough to maintain the life. So not surprisingly, we probably know that during those years, a lot of people died of starvation or health issues related to malnutrition. The deaths from that famine was over 30 million. That's a conservative estimate, because quite a few researchers, they argue that the number could be between 37 to over 40 million. But let's conservatively say that 30 million or over. Now, the tricky thing is that before the famine started, China was not short of food supply. And in fact, that in 1958, 59, the crops were good. But in 1958, there was the so-called Great Leap Forward campaign. With that, China attempted to catch up with the UK and exceed the US. And so a lot of people, including farmers, were mobilized to do a lot of weird things, such as producing metal, or producing iron and steel. And therefore, a lot of good crops were not harvested. And because in 1958, a lot of people believed that China had already entered into communism society and food was not an issue anymore. But then with a lot of misinformation in the society, with the food not harvested, famine started to spread. And here I mentioned that the 3-year famine, 1959 to 61, that's what the Chinese government would like to call it. It's a 3-year, other than longer. But in fact, that some researchers believe that famine and deaths from starvation had already started in 1958. That's a year of good crops, but not good harvest. And the famine didn't stop until the mid-1962. Well, in China, the Chinese government like to say it's a 3-year natural disaster. That's why a lot of people died of hunger because of the natural disaster. And probably it's easier for them to convince the public that the natural disaster lasted for 3 years. But otherwise, if it's 5 years, it might be difficult to convince people to believe that how could it be possible that the country had 5 years continuous natural disasters. But even for 3 years, when people looked into the data, they found out that the natural disasters in those 3 years were not severe than many other years. Plus the fact that China is such a vast country, not all places, even if there is, even if there was a disaster, but it wouldn't happen everywhere. Well, when people started to die of starvation, there were limited help and support to help those people, particularly those in rural areas. And during those years, China even still net exported cereals to other countries. Well, for those people who do not know much about China's history or China's politics, that must be very sort of confusing. When the people in the country were starving, how could we still export food to other countries? But in the meantime, China also refused to accept help from other countries. Even the new enemy at that time, the USSR, offered to help China, but China refused. Well, then the only chances for people is to probably try to beg to other regions where food may be relatively available. But unfortunately, a lot of those people who wanted to move to other places to find food, they were not allowed because local cars did not want to let people in other regions know that people from their region were starving. And that will be very sort of a face losing. So the consequence, as we said, that a lot of people died of starvation. I have a few extracts from a few books. And this is the book by Jesper Baker, Hungry Ghosts, China's Secret Famine. Well, the description here, as you can see, that if you imagine the picture, is just very sad. And the book's title says China's Secret Famine. Well, because for a lot of people around the globe, they didn't know, or they don't know China had the famine. Even today, a lot of people still don't know. But even worse, that nowadays in China, many people, particularly those younger generations, they don't know what has happened in the history. If you talk to those people after the 1980s, say that millions of people starved to death, they probably will be very angry with you because you didn't want to help improve China's reputation. And I didn't try to translate this. I thought probably it's a bit difficult. But nonetheless, as I will mention shortly, this book has been translated into English. And that's another miserable picture by Zhangyue Zhou. And this book is a great book, although the contents are very, very sad. Just in case that some of you might be interested in the topic, so I'll just highlight a few key literature in this area. So in addition to Baker, Dakota also had a great book about the history of China's most devastating catastrophe. In Baker's book, he rightly pointed out that since the secrecy and dictatorship which made the famine possible still exist, it should serve as a terrible warning against what might happen again. That's part of the reason I want to bother China's food security, because as he said that because of this, you never know what may happen in China in the future. And in Dakota's book, he pointed out that that famine was the worst catastrophe in China's history and one of the worst anywhere. For those books in Chinese, one is by Mr. Yang, and he attributed the famine to China's totalitarian system and the refusal of officials at every level to value human life. And the book was published in English in 2012. There are two other books. One is by Iwa. She tried to search those survivors of the Great Famine. And in her book, he recorded those victims of the famine with their names and addresses. And it also records events of cannibalism. Another book by the Lauge Research Foundation, and they recorded also quite a few personal experiences and stories by those foreign scholars who studied the famine. And there are two very good databases, and there are a lot of information there. And I put the link here, and if later on you can sort of access. Well, after the Great Famine, after a lot of people died of starvation, so started from 1962, and Mao allowed Liu Shaoqi to manage quite a few economic matters. And then the country's food output started to improve. And as a result, people's food intake has also started to improve. Well, we see the upward trend here. Well, we would wish that the food intake continuously increase so that to at least reach the average dietary requirement. But unfortunately, it was not the case. So just when the food availability improved, then in 1966, Mao started the Cultural Revolution. And this revolution lasted for 10 years. And during these 10 years, you can see that initially, food intake dropped because all farmers were also mobilized to engage in revolution. By that time, I was a little over 10 years old. So by here, I was a teenager. And as a child, I remembered quite a bit what happened during those times. Basically, if they tell people that Mao had a recent new guidelines, whatever, for people, then those farmers had to get up midnight and then to march to the city to celebrate the announcement of Mao's new guidelines or new instructions for the people. 最高指示. And because I was young, I thought that was good fun. So I was very keen to get up midnight to join those adults to go to march. But then imagine that for those farmers, they had to work next day to produce. So that's why you see that the food intake cannot be increased because farmers just probably didn't have the ability to do their work adequately. And then by the mid of the Cultural Revolution, farmers started to sort of ignore a little bit about those political matters, and they started to just work on their own business. Although food production didn't increase much, but still that with farmers' dedication, things improved a little bit. But on average, the food intake still didn't increase much, and partly because of the fast increase of China's population, and therefore per capita increase is minimal. So now, from what I have described, you can see that before the famine took place, China was not short of food supply. In fact, that by 1957, food supply was improving all the time. Even in 1958, 59, food crops were good, or the harvests were not good. So we can't blame that food was short of supply. And then what's wrong? Well, what's wrong is because the country was in danger. So that's a quotation from Professor Tobata of Japan. I like it, and I like to use it and to share it with those people who care to listen to me. Because I think that typically describes China's situation for the Great Famine and also the starvation during the Cultural Revolution, because a country is in danger, not because food becomes short of supply, rather when the country is in danger, food becomes short of supply. I hope that you agree with me that China's famine and the Cultural Revolution time period starvation
Sure.
actually proves his comments. Well, fortunately for the Chinese people, since the early 1980s, food availability has steadily improved. Today, food is basically abundant everywhere in China. The supply of dietary energy, protein, and fat has become adequate and more than adequate. You see that for dietary energy supply, by the early 1980s, it reached the average dietary requirement. So that means at least that on average, people have the necessary food for their body. And in terms of fat, in the late 1980s, it reached the requirement. For protein, a little bit late, but still by the early 1980s, it reached the sort of a requirement. And if you look at the later years, the supply is way above the requirement. And from here, you can see that from the late 1990s to the mid 1910s, in terms of those key indicators of food security for China, it continuously improved. So for this one, that's the percentage. It's average dietary energy supply adequacy. So it's derived by using the dietary energy supply divided by the average dietary energy requirement. So if it's over 100, that means it's adequate. But for China, by the later 1990s, by the mid 1990s, China's food supply adequacy had been achieved and then continuously improved. And protein and fat supply nowadays, on average, way above the requirements. Prevalence of undernourishment dropped by more than 10 percentage points. And for children under 5 years of age, affected by wasting reduced, affected by stunting reduced, and underweight reduced. So overall, it points to the much improved food availability in China. Well, prior to and since the early 1980s, we see that the food availability is hugely different. We probably would wonder why the difference? Why at one time it's scarce, but on the in other time food was abundant. Well, a number of factors that have led to the food scarcity. Probably most importantly is collectivization. Since 1958, Chinese farmers were organized into the People's Commune, under which we had the production brigade and then the production team. But under that sort of arrangement, given the Chinese sort of a small farming over the long history, a lot of farmers were not interested, or they didn't contribute wholeheartedly to the work of the production team. So food output was much lower than otherwise. And then totalitarian system was another factor, because under this system, individuals have little freedom to do whatever they want to do. And for all of those economic activities, they were also planned by higher level. So basically people just couldn't do much whatever. And therefore we can't talk too much about creativity and innovation. And then because of that system, the error correcting mechanisms were not there. So even though, say, since 1957, when there were many problems, issues, then just no one dared to say, or if you did so, and your fate was doomed, like Peng Dehuai. And particularly since in 1957, the so-called anti-right campaign that also shut a lot of people's mouths up. So even though there are a lot of weird things, crazy things happening, but that those problems just could not be corrected. And in that system, officials couldn't care less about the public's welfare. And when the famine took place, they just care about themselves and their immediate families. And probably another factor is that a lot of those government officials didn't have the ability to manage the economy, because those government officials, a lot of them were previously soldiers, because they managed to help the Communist Party to grab the power. But when they were appointed as government officials, they knew little to manage the economy. Well, what have contributed to the food abundance? Allowing farmers to revert back to household-based farming was initially a major determinant. Here, I didn't say that the government had the initiative to allow the household-based farming, because that was not true. And it was the farmers who insisted to have household-based farming. Initially, the government didn't want them to do it. And when many more farmers chose to do it, they tried hard to stop. And even when a large percentage of farmers had gone to household-based farming, they still wanted to reverse the course. And all of these were recorded in the documents of the Communist Party. So basically, the government was forced to allow farmers to revert back to household-based farming. Another factor is that the markets were allowed to play a role. They allowed farmers to sell their surplus or whatever they wish to sell to the market, even though they didn't have enough to eat. But if they wanted to have some cash, they like to sell. But in those periods where the extremes were present, farmers were not allowed to sell anything to the market. Well, if you can't sell, there were less incentives for people to produce more. So the market was also allowed to work in the overall economy that generally helped the farmers to produce more, because now they can sell more to have more cash. Opening up to the world is another important factor, because that allowed Chinese people to see what's happening elsewhere, also allowed Chinese people to learn management expertise from people around the world. Engaging in international trade is another important one. If allowing farmers to revert back to household-based farming was an important one, but the impact from that factor was sort of short-lived, because once the potential was released, basically, the effect would generally disappear. But this one had a long-lasting impact on China's food abundance, because through international food trade, any shortages in the country can be compensated. And also China's engagement in trade in general helped the country to use its competitive advantages to gain a lot of benefits from the international market. And the engagement in trade probably is one of the major sources for its economic expansion and increase in per capita income. You see that since year 2000, China's per capita income, here we use the GDP, has been increasing quite impressively. If you look at the data before that, it also increased nicely from the early 1980s. So the continuous improvement in people's income had a very positive impact in the longer term on China's food consumption and overall the country's food availability system. Now, with these factors contributing to improve China's food availability, we see that overall, as assessed by the FAO, China's food availability is just very comfortable, and nowadays probably just, well, way too high. So in terms of dietary energy supply, now it's over 3,300. For protein and fat, and since year 2000, they all increased steadily. And probably nowadays, having too much fat is an issue, other than not adequate. So that's the dietary energy supply adequacy. You see that from the beginning of 2000, it was already over 115. And that's more than adequate, but still improved. So by now, it's almost to 137, 38. That's very comfortable. In terms of the some other indicators, you see that the prevalence of undernourishment has steadily improved. Now it's below 2.5%. So that's a great achievement if we trust the data from FAO. And in terms of the child affected by stunting, dropped. Affected by wasting, also dropped. Now it's about 2.5%. In this diagram, the only thing that slightly increased is children under 5 years of age who are overweight. Although that's not good, but still from one angle that reflected that the Chinese children nowadays have so much to eat. I wish I had this overweight problem when I was a child, but I didn't. Well, the economists also try to assess food security in various countries. They use the so-called Global Food Security Index to measure. So for China, the Global Food Security Index steadily increased from 2012, the first year when the index was compiled. So by 2021, it increased by almost 10 percentage points. And so China nowadays sits in a quite sort of a high range. Well, China's food availability obviously has improved impressively, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there are no issues. Some major issues and challenges in the Chinese food security management are given here. Food quality and safety is one of them. Although food is plenty, but it's not necessarily that you are sure that you will have safe and quality food. And in most cases, those unsafe and low quality foods are made by people deliberately, which is very sad. And the sustainable supply from the domestic production may also be an issue due to resource constraints, because China's desire to pursue higher GDP. So they achieved the higher GDP at the expense of the environment. So nowadays, both the quantity and the quality of the natural resources have deteriorated. As I mentioned earlier, equitable food access is important, but in China nowadays, even from the government statistics, there are still a large number of people who have low income, although they may probably not suffering too much as people in the famine system not having food to eat, but probably they might have to resort to those low quality and less safe food to eat. And overall, the social stability in China is another matter, because without social stability, food security will be undermined. A lot of people nowadays, they don't know how to cherish food. So the wastes are pretty high. If those loss and wastes could be reduced or avoided, that can also help to improve food utilization. China does have a food reserve system, which is necessary, but the management is not transparent, because the Chinese government regard food reserve information as national secret, because they believe that it's of strategic importance and not good to let people in other countries to know how much they have. Well, I personally think that's sort of a silly reasoning, because if you share the information with other countries, and then the world market could react to what's happening there by adjusting their food production activities, therefore would be good for you to manage your food security. And the other problem is that China doesn't have strategies to deal with potential food security crisis according to the severity. Every time when there is a crisis, the government would be very panic, and they will mobilize everything to deal with the crisis, even though the crisis was not very serious. But that's not good, because that can easily cause a lot of unnecessary distortions in the system, which could have longer term impacts, negative impacts. If you have forced China's food security matters, you will know that the government has reacted sometimes even to some academics' comments. The one most famous one is the comment by Mr. Lester Brown about whether China would starve the world. And a lot of Chinese government resources were mobilized to handle that. That's not necessary. You handle it according to the severity, and then also have a system to monitor what's going on. That will help the country to deal with future food crises very more effectively. Well, these problems, can we sort of fix them? Well, it's not easy, because that's why I call them remaining and emerging problems. It's not easy to fix them, most importantly, because there is a lack of desire for the people in the country and for the government to carry out innovative reforms to the country's institutions. particularly its political institutions. And a lot of people are so comfortable with what they are now, but they're not worried too much about what may happen in the future. They probably believe that what they have now may last for long. Well, that's part of the reason I wanted to talk about today's topic. So this probably is the most important challenge for the Chinese people. If that challenge cannot be overcome, a lot of these problems will stay. Because, for example, food safety. If we don't have the proper institutions, people will just continuously to produce those unsafe food. Well, in addition to the above challenges, there are also some recent developments that might impact on China's food security in the future. First one is moving backwards. So from following Mao's death in 1976, China gradually moved away from totalitarianism to authoritarianism. But unfortunately, science since the mid-2010s have shown that the country is moving backwards, and moving backwards very fastly. This is most concerning. And moving backwards politically also causes other problems. People tend to become more inward looking. And nowadays, quite a few people started to, again, promote collectivization. China doesn't have the environment to practice collectivization because just a lot of people are just not committed to this. And as we probably have noticed that recently, the private entrepreneurs' activities are also limited. This is very sort of painful because private enterprises have contributed to China's economic expansion enormously and contributed to the growth in people's income and the employment. Recently, we see some irresponsible trading practices from China. Probably since the outbreak of COVID, this becomes a bit more apparent. But even before that, China was pretty good at practicing irresponsible trading practices. That's not good. That's not good. And as a net food importing country, it's useful to maintain a good relationship with those food exporting countries. You might have heard that in the past 2 years, China have tried to restrict food imports from Australia. That hurts Australian farmers, but ultimately it hurts China. And when China have these sort of practices, other countries are also looking, and they don't know what you're going to do if they rely too much on you. You see that according to a recent calculation by Douyin, China's food self-sufficiency ratio has dropped from year 2000, almost 100%, to today's about 76%. So in either cases, the imports or the deficiency is very much the same. So that means 1/4 of China's food was imported. And in any case, if a government is responsible, you probably wouldn't sort of try to bitch by punishing a country with the wish that I can import from other places. Because what happens if one day there are major global food shortages? And in the past years, particularly since the outbreak of the COVID, China's image in the global stage was not improving very much, probably got worse quite a bit. So all of these new developments could impact on China's future food production domestically and also food imports globally. So I hope that by now, from what I have tried to say, we should have some ideas about whether China can sustain its current level of food security. I reckon that basically it's upon the Chinese people and the Chinese government. If the country behaves in a mature and a responsible manner, both domestically and internationally, there is a good chance for China to maintain its current level of food security or even improve further. But otherwise, really don't know. And if there is an extreme, if Chinese people could still have some food to have a sufficient food to eat, I think there will be a good news. So just quickly to have a few concluding comments. China has impressively improved its food security and the current level is comfortable. However, its political system provides no institutional guarantee to sustain this level. And the recent move back to the old system can seriously undermine the current level of food security. How China's food security may evolve depends on the future course, its government and its public truth. Well, now I'm happy to have some questions from you. And I'll just leave Professor Tobeto's comments here while I receive your questions.